future belongs to English, basically.
I think the majesty of
I will speak in English, but that English is closer.
We are much more comfortable talking in English than in our own mother tongue.
This country has 11 official
Asia
languages.
is becoming English.
English is a very difficult language to perfect.
Trying to revitalize our language.
A high proportion of all internet transmissions are in English.
Something like a quarter of the world's population speak English now.
400 years ago, a modestly successful English playwright called William Shakespeare produced some of the greatest masterpieces of English literature to entertain the local audience at a tiny London theatre. Today, tourists are drawn from all over the world in pilgrimage to a replica of the original Globe Theatre on London's Bankside. Here, Shakespeare, the populist Elizabethan dramatist, is offered up to a reverent public in a nostalgic pageant of an age when media meant theatre and multimedia meant there was more than one to choose from.
In the 1580s, people were saying that English had no particular future, either as a world language or as a literary language. Then along comes Shakespeare and the other Elizabethan dramatists, and suddenly we get the most extraordinary manifestation of the English language.
Poured a flagon of Rhenish on my head once. This same Scalzer was Yorick Scalzer, the King's Jester.
This.
In that?
Let me see.
What Shakespeare did is he showed us how daring you can be with the language. He showed people how to be creative with the language.
Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio. He was a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy.
Most of the words that Shakespeare invented never became part of the English language. They died out. You know, they came and they're just Shakespearean, and that's all one can say about them. But when he uses new words and says, you know, grace me no grace, or uncle me no uncle, or Cleopatra says, he words me, girls, he words me, and you get these words like grace and uncle and word, originally nouns, being used as verbs, and showing how you can play about with the language in all kinds of ways. He's giving lessons to all of us about the importance of creativity in English, and lessons which have come to be very influential in the subsequent history of the language.
Now get you to my lady's chamber and tell her, let her paint an inch thick. To this favor she must come.
The cozy intimacy of the Globe, where actors and audience alike share the common experience of the play, is a far cry from the relentless and inescapable media bombardment to which we are now all subject.
He's traveled. No, thank you.
1, 2, 3. Now let's...
The wind has really picked up.
The world no longer has to be conjured up by imagination. It's now delivered to our homes 24 hours a day in every conceivable form.
Top-notch, a rip-roaring tune. Forget.
Yet woven into the bewildering cacophony of the world's globalized media, vestiges remain of one of the most successful means by which the language was carried around the world: the Bible.
There is one network that will preach the gospel in Jerusalem and discover the ways for you to be involved in preparing the world for the return of Jesus Christ.
Pat Robertson is a missionary for the 21st century. His Christian Broadcasting Network utilizes the full panoply of satellite broadcasting to deliver his evangelical message to an international audience.
Now, from CBN, taking you from information to understanding.
Well, welcome everyone to this edition of the 700 Club. I'm Pat Robertson.
Well, we started back in 1960. The thought was to take a television station and claim it for Jesus Christ and begin religious broadcasting. We were the first in the nation to have a brand new station devoted more than 50% to religious programming.
Every day, someone, somewhere is looking for answers, looking for a place that's beyond all their problems and fears.
We broadcast in, I've heard numbers as high as 165 different countries. We have a big presence in India and Indonesia and Thailand and the countries in Asia, plus major broadcasts in all over Africa and in Latin America.
As I read the book of John, ladies and gentlemen, Jesus Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. And I personally am one who have carried the good news of Jesus Christ, and I've seen multitudes of people accept Jesus.
I think the majesty of the King James Version of the Bible has influenced the thinking, certainly here in the United States, of generations of leaders. The eloquence of Abraham Lincoln, for example, came directly out of his reading and study of the King James Bible. I think this is true of practically all of the great statesmen of America.
The impact of the King James Bible has been one of the cornerstones in the development of modern English and a profound cultural influence on the language.
When James I came to the throne in 1603, one of the first things he did was to actually produce a new translation of the Bible, going back to the Hebrew and the Greek texts. The translators were concerned to make this accessible in terms of its language, definitely English in terms of its language. For example, the biblical characters, they didn't use Hebrew forms, they used well-known English forms. They also used a lot of synonyms. Where one word was used in the original Greek or the Hebrew, they would use a variety of English words that meant the same thing. The King James Bible became the authorised version that sat in the churches, but also it became a Bible for private use. In 1612, they published much smaller editions than this, so people could carry it around with them, which meant, of course, that it had very much more influence than almost any other copy. This Bible was current during the time that the British Empire was being built. In 1611, we were at the beginning of voyages to America that led to the establishment of the colonies there. Later on, of course, we were involved in the East India Company. We went to India. As the 18th century progressed and the empire was built, British influence went wider and wider. Soldiers, sailors, administrators, missionaries of various sorts. And this was the Bible that they were taking with them. The King James Bible was the version that people had used, they'd read, they'd thought about, they'd criticised, they'd taught from, they'd drawn moral inspiration from for well over 200 years.
The thing about influential books like the King James Bible is that they travel. As missionary activity developed around the world, they took with them the authorized version. And therefore you suddenly find in little churches and chapels and institutions all over the world a copy of the Bible, or people quoting from it and using it and giving sermons and homilies and discussing religious issues with reference to it. And so it did have this amazing impact. It traveled the world faster than the spoken language did.
The story in South Africa was a familiar one repeated in every part of the globe.
When the first missionaries arrived, but also when other colonists arrived who were very little to do with the church and brought their language with them, one of the first points of contact between colonists and local people was the church. And for all sorts of reasons, people came to the church, joined the church, and in the first instance began worshipping in the English language before there were any translations. So the Book of Common Prayer, 16th century English, and the King James Bible, 17th century English, were in many ways the first common denominator between local African people and the missionaries.
Remarkably, in a country as linguistically diverse as South Africa, English has retained its place long after the end of colonialism.
We are prisoners of history, and though some things were bad that came with the colonizers, nevertheless, I think we have come to recognize that English is part of our culture as South Africans, and so it contributes to the richness of our diversity as a nation and as a worshiping community.
When I came here, there was a policy that first month is this Zulu, Xhosa, Tswana, and so on. But for me, it has been very difficult to stick to one language. So I felt, just mix the languages, Tswana, Zulu, Xhosa, and Sesotho, and English, so that I could reach each and every person present.
Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Jesus Christ, who is the full and unexpected fulfillment of the Father's promise.
I think it is very important to learn English just as well as the African language, because honestly, I've done theology, and there are terms that I cannot express myself in my own language because I've done that in an English language.
We find that in the book of Revelation, chapter 2, verse 13. He shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
In the service, I try to balance, the worship to be traditionally and to be African, because I know some people, they don't have the background of the Anglicanism. Therefore, my belief is to balance everything. Balance the languages, balance the worship.
We live in a global village, and one of the fundamental aspects of this global village is that we are interdependent as a human community. There's a need of a kind of a common medium, and English is one such common medium. I think it will be foolhardy to try and reinvent the wheel and try to find one commonality when in fact we already have the English language that does that.
But African exposure to the language of the Bible was not confined to the continent of Africa. Europe's shameful history of slave trading accounted for the forcible exile of an estimated 12 million Africans to service the plantations of European colonists. Transported in inhuman conditions, many died in transatlantic voyages, and the survivors were condemned to a life of brutality, stripped of all human rights. In Atlanta, in America's South, the legacy of slavery lives on in the language of African Americans.
The making of America as a nation had much to do with having a language that we could identify as the language of the country. And English was that language, but Africans brought into this country were brought and colonized here. And one of the ways that we distinguish those who are part of the nation and those who are not a part of the nation is by the language.
Denied formal education under slavery, Africans were compelled to develop their own unique dialects of English, a process which found expression in Baptist churches all over the South.
He was saying, I need to talk to somebody. When that door opened, I said, well, you're living, and I noticed you bought coffee, and I noticed you just ordered some meal. Things ain't as bad as you think.
If you remember Jesus in the gospel, he always spoke in parable.
So I try to take stuff that I do in everyday life, and I use that back in the church so they can understand where I'm coming from, and they get a greater sense of the message. And so I try to translate what the word is saying to their everyday life.
What was Partner doing? I was doing, amen, what Jesus did. I was using the circumstances to let him know that in spite of what you're going through, the Lord is still making a way.
Keeping African Americans outside of literacy and outside of language teaching excluded them from that Americanness. And so while the community of African Americans grew and maintained its identity by using a language that kept the community unified, yet acquiring the language that allowed them to succeed and move into the wider community, we grew to this day to have two existing languages side by side in the same country.
For generations, black dialects were despised as slang. But more recently, the academic community has come to acknowledge the rich diversity of African American English and created a whole new area of study called Ebonics. For Mary Ziegler's students, it is a recognition long overdue.
Who's teaching our kids how to speak correctly? Who? I mean, who even taught our parents or our grandparents to speak correctly? It was against the law for them to read. So anything they picked up on, it was just by hearsay.
Right.
If you was never properly shown how to read and how to write, you do the best you can, you survive. And that's what they did.
Yeah,
that's what they did.
That just came out of nowhere. It has roots in West African languages.
Right.
And people don't be trying to understand
the
that.
historical background of
exactly.
it. Right.
It's not about this is bad and this is good. We got to get out of that dichotomous thinking. Right. It's not bad and good. It's about teaching our kids what will enable them to be more successful in life, but not sacrificing what they already know. Like if your son comes home one day after a long day at school, it says, "Mom," you ask him, "Son, do you have homework?" And your son goes, "I ain't got no homework."
Right.
Your son does not mean, "Mother, I do not have any homework."
Right.
Your son means, "I ain't got no homework."
Exactly what he
and
said.
it actually makes sense.
Right.
Folks just don't realize that when we be talking like that, we understand each other. And it's just a different way of expressing. Some things you just can't be saying in standard English.
As my students demonstrate all the time, they can read and they can speak in standard English, but when they get together, they prefer to talk in their own community language. And in fact, everyone really does prefer to speak in the language which identifies them with a particular community.
Black dialect is just a variety of the English. No one really goes around speaking standard variety English. The people that are really talking to our kids about, saying, you all don't need to speak that, or what y'all speaking, or that's slang.
Right.
They're speaking their own variety. People do not know
the difference between slang and dialect.
Exactly.
And slang is so widely accepted by both communities. I mean, you really don't know. I never have tried to hide how I speak. That's me, and that gives me identity. I want to be me. I don't want to be like everybody else. And if my language identifies me as somebody else or as part of the AAVE community, that is just fine with me, because that's me and that's my history and my family history as well.
Yeah.
It's because of the influence of Africans in this country that English has developed in the way that it has. And in fact, it's the presence of Africans in this country that has caused America to develop the way that it has.
Politic, talk tick, as this poet rips. Talk tick, Mr. Politician. Your cops are on a mission, and if you're born with colored skin, you're instantly under suspicion. Mrs. Politician. Don't forget to listen, but more importantly, don't forget to change these degrading conditions. The color of our skin is painted with conflict, that it's getting massive. And the politic, talk tick, as this poet rips. Talk tick, and it's time. The election, and we got the power to lead it. Believe it.
7825, code 6, 1.
What else, bro?
The once marginalized sounds of black English have now become so mainstream in American society that they are used to persuade young people of all backgrounds to participate in the democratic process of a presidential election.
Right now, we're on a 25-city bus tour going all around the country, registering kids to vote. It is a festival atmosphere. We've got a lot of bands out here, and we're getting people interested by that. So people come see the music, they hear the politicians speak, and they check out the organizations that we've got going on behind me.
Young brothers campaign and to find enough votes to win at election time. You know, it's the Bible of the fish. Street politics. It's money out there. Go get street politics. And help your hood become the strong. Street politics. Let's see which one will last the long. Street politics.
Well, I think it's important that people understand that you got to vote to be heard. You know what I'm saying? You can't sit at the house talking about what's wrong, what's right, and you're not making a difference. So me and my fellas come all the way down from Cleveland, Ohio to represent the youth. You know what I'm saying? And I understand that sometimes the youth don't feel like they heard. But to be heard, we got to do this. Then we got to go home and vote on the issues at hand.
But that's ground for a beatdown, because that's treason.
The acceptance of African American idioms into everyday language has been reflected in the tremendous popularity of black music.
They be diplomats. They talk it out while the
Artistic success has been both a means and a byproduct of asserting the rights of the black community within a predominantly white society.
Yeah. What? That entertainment, we offer love and peace. We ain't for
In Africa, a more traditional approach to English has persisted, with the Bible and Shakespeare more discernible influences. The Market Theatre in Johannesburg is one of South Africa's leading centres for the performing arts. It often produces plays in English, but with a very African cultural interpretation. John Kani is the theatre's managing trustee.
The Market Theatre grew by creating a space for both black and white artists to confront each other, to talk about black and white issues, to talk about apartheid, to talk about how I hate them and how they fear me, why they fear me, why I hate them. We created work examining those attitudes and feelings. We used also quite a lot classics, and which we adapted to suit the South African situation.
He's married.
To who?
Married.
During apartheid, Kani starred in an acclaimed production of Shakespeare's Othello, a play which mirrored many of the prejudices of the day.
Oh, thou foul thief! Where is thou stowed, my daughter?
Good Signor, you shall more command with years than with your weapon. When we did Othello, and I still remember Janet Suzman was directing, and she kept talking about performances by Lord Olivier, a performance by Paul Robeson, brilliant performance by so-and-so and so-and-so. And I said, I can't find the reference for myself. I'm an African, a Xhosa tribesman. I have to translate this text into Xhosa for me, so I understand it in Xhosa. Then I translate it back to English in order to understand what I'm doing. So I will be a little slower than the other actors whose first language is English, whose culture is English. I am not English. I'm an African. I am a Xhosa man. So I see Othello as one of the great warriors that my grandfather used to tell us about, who fought against amaqulukhwebe, konqilo nakochawe koqaqawule, kumaqoba amade.
I hate the Moor, and 'tis thought abroad that 'twixt my sheets he's done my office.
I saw Iago as Der Blanche, the white hope, the Volksstaat, who wants to establish a white homeland, who truly believed that it was by God's decree that the black man in this country was made to be the carrier of water and the cutters of wood, and that he is subhuman and slightly intelligent, but not like whites. I saw Desdemona as this young little white thing that is exposed one more time innocently to a contact with a very handsome, wonderful Xhosa tribesman.
Whip me, you devil's from the possession of this heavenly sight. Blow me about in winds, roast me in sulfur, wash me in steep down gulfs of liquid fire.
And that's how we began to work in an African way, in context, to localize, so that I am actually speaking in Xhosa. But for your benefit, because you're ignorant, you do not understand my language, I will speak in English, but that English is Xhosa. It sounds English to you for your benefit. One cannot deny the role of English internationally. One can also not deny the role of the colonialists when they came to our continent, in our country. They tried very much to take our culture from ourselves. They taught us their ways. Affluence and civility was measured on how the white man behaves and how the black man behaves like the white man. And when the Boers took over in 1948, it became apparent to us as artists that the only way to fight our struggle is to speak in the language which the master understands, to tell the master to go to hell in his own language, to tell the master that I'm taking it no more in his own language. Thus, professional theater and entertainment began to take English over as a communication, as a weapon for the struggle.
Perhaps the country where history has had the most effect on the linguistic landscape is India. Modern urban India may be unrecognizable from the country that gained independence from Britain in 1947, but its attachment to the language of the former colonial power grows stronger by the day. As one of the dwindling number of Britons who stayed on after independence, Nigel Henkin has seen the changes firsthand.
I was Army, of course, like everybody else at that time, 45. I'd been in North Africa, and then the Europe War was finished. The Jap War was still going on when I left England, and they'd sent me to Burma. And I got to Bombay in July 45, and then waiting transport to Burma, and then mid-August the war finished.
Retired from the British High Commission, Nigel now makes his living guiding small groups of tourists.
Cannon of the old East India Company still here, and they ruled India until 1858. I try and show some British history, a little religious background at a very low level, because I only take very small numbers of people.
Nigel is a living reminder of the origins of English in India.
To some people still have that idea that it's colonialist and we should dump it, but economic facts are you need English. And what a tremendous advantage India has. Chap from Iceland comes here, they can speak perfectly, both of them. He was here only yesterday, the Prime Minister, President of Iceland was here this week earlier. No problem, just English. Everybody, he has English, they have English.
But Indians themselves have many different attitudes to the English language. In the corridors of Delhi University, students can be seen reading Shakespeare, and in a classroom listening to Professor Harish Trivedi lecturing on Byron. It is ironic that the dangers posed by English are most recognized in this environment.
I am myself engaged in the current post-colonial debate about what to do with English language and literature in India, now that we've been independent for half a century. So I try and alert them to how, for example, in the case of a writer like Byron, there are still hidden Indian connections, which perhaps a British academic or an American academic may not even wish to look at, may not register. And thus, the human race goes on. What a curious way the whole thing is of clothing souls in clay. Clay is, of course, what we are made of, dust returning to dust, that's Christian. But clothing souls is very Hindu. Now here again is a Hindu idea being mixed up with a Christian idea. Many Indians are beginning to write in English, in bigger numbers. They always did, some of them, but now they have greater international acclaim and acceptability. especially after Salman Rushdie and the Booker Prize awarded to him in 1981. And the rewards financially and in terms of global readership are much higher than for writing in any Indian language. So there's a second kind of devaluation going on of our own literatures now.
The spread of literature in English has marginalized many Hindi writers, as the BBC's former India correspondent Mark Tully observes.
If you go around Delhi, for instance, you'll find it really quite difficult to buy books in Hindi. And that Hindi writers don't get the same advances, don't get the same notice, don't get the same publicity, don't get anything like that. But, you know, I could quote some novels in Hindi to you which tell you much more about India than any of the highly praised English novels written by Indians about India.
Because Indian writing in English has this unfair advantage of English being a global language, the royalties that are paid to our writers are much, much higher. I think the royalty that somebody like Arundhati Roy or Salman Rushdie gets for just one book is enough to buy out all the publishing houses in Hindi.
While India's literary elite are concerned about English, its new media youth have embraced and reinvented the language.
Channel V presents Ranveer and Vinay in Looking London, Talking Tokyo.
Your friendly neighborhood stereo punkies. Watch them go bananas as never seen before. It doesn't get any better than this.
Channel V started about 6 years ago. We sort of defined our audience as an urban, upscale Indian youth aged 15 to 35.
Our design and feel and the whole format of the channel is very V, and it's very, it takes influences from everywhere, but it's very Indian, yet very distinctive. It never is a Firangi thing as we call foreign things. It's never very Firangi. So it always is Indian.
Definitely, and whatever references or influences we do take from the West is always owned and adapted by us into a unique Indian context.
Mind it.
That's the way we treat Western influences. It's always treated with a lot of irreverence, and unless we start owning it, we don't put it out.
He sings away your blues and turns your soul into gold. Here's Anthony.
You can't say we broadcast in English. We play all kinds of software. There's Hindi film music, there's Tamil film music, there's English music, there's Latin music, Arabic music. We play all kinds of music. But the unifying language is English. Urban Indian upscale youth speak English across the country, and it is considered an Indian language.
Nowhere is this more true than in the affluent bars and pubs of downtown Bombay. Here, English is not just the unquestioned language of choice, but a badge of style and class.
The young people now just talk in English. They have treated English as their first language, and that has a lot to do with our education system as well. We are made to believe that English is our first language. We all are educated in English, which is why I guess English becomes the most important language for all of us. We are much more comfortable talking in English than in our own mother tongue or the national language, because we all talk in English all the time.
Anybody that might just click. That's one very talented guy called Ash. He sings so well, Siddhi, it's not even... If you know someone who wants a good singer in any language in the world, he's here.
There are two kinds of English-speaking audience in India. One is the pseudo crowd, where at the parties they sip wine and that book was so wonderful, this painting is so ooh, la-di-da, and basically they're just bullshitting themselves. But there's a more like an urban approach where the young guys, the lingo the young guys talk, that's more because they need to converse with people, because probably if I see a beautiful girl sitting by the bar, I want to make a move, so I make a move in English. If I open a line in Hindi, she'd go, you're not getting any. So it's more adapting for a reason. But there they do it to show off,
Like this can happen only on Channel V.
It's kind of sad, but it's uncool to speak in your own mother tongue, and it's cool to speak in English. Everybody would like to hear something in English rather than if I say it in Hindi.
English may be making inroads into youth television, but in Bollywood movies, Hindi is still king.
To make a Hindi film that works, to make what you call a pan-Indian film which really becomes a success with everybody from north to south is an impossible feat. And whenever anybody achieves that feat, we really salute that individual. Because to have a country like this, as diverse as this, and to make a movie work with the millions is nothing short of a miracle.
Bollywood is about money. Movies are made for mass Hindi-speaking audiences, and any use of English is limited to what these audiences might understand.
The language that we speak in our Hindi films is a very easily comprehensible, understandable language. And there is a lot of English thrown in. There was a time in the sort of 50s and early 60s when it wasn't so. But today, you'll find a lot of English words being used. And what's happened is that a lot of dialogue is translated. If there's a sentence said in English, it will be translated into Hindi.
देखो अजय, मैं चाहती हूँ कि मेरा बच्चा अपनी पहली सांस ऐसी हवा मिले जहाँ पे जात पात की गंदगी ना हो. Is it too much to ask for?
So more and more stress is being laid on English, in spite of what the present government might say about Hindi being the national language. In the last 10 years, people have started, a number of young producers, directors have come up who are producing films in English. They are Indian directors, Indian producers, with Indian local actors, but making films in English.
Sound. Rolling.
Films like Nagesh Kukuno's Bollywood Calling are now appealing to a wider English-speaking audience.
Action.
मैं तेरा खून पी जाऊंगा कुत्ते! Bastard! चिल्लाओ मत! You will not leave here alive. तुम्हें इधर से पुछ के नहीं जाएगा. आज तक कोई ऐसा जेल नहीं बना जो ठाकुर रणवीर सिंह को कैद रख सके, समझे?
Cut it! Print!
Good job, Pat.
As we see more films in English, I think the topics are just going to get so widespread and will move away from a typical romantic comedy or, you know, the thriller genre or something. You might actually see different kinds of films.
Good. No safety? What? Manuji is here only for half an hour. I want 10 set ready. Sorry, what did you say?
Not important.
Day after, we are doing your song picturization. You will be singing and dancing around trees.
Six, seven, eight, 1, 2, 1, 2, 9, 9, 9. Jerk it harder. जोर से झटका मारो. Come on.
About 5% of India speaks English, but that's a staggeringly huge number. More filmmakers are catering to this group. All of a sudden, that number goes out and watches a film. Well, you have a huge box office success.
Director Indira Mukherjee is taking this a step further by planning an English film aimed solely at an English-speaking Indian audience.
I don't think I'm taking that much of a risk because I've just realized that people want to see the kind of film I'm making. People are, sort of tired of watching the same Hindi film over and over again with the same faces, with people dancing around trees and whatever. The basic thought behind the film is very English. It's about the English-speaking urban Indian youth who, so far, I don't know if they have found the right kind of platform to sort of voice themselves or to showcase their own, professional aspirations or whatever. But this film is definitely going to, put them on the same platform as the world youth, at least the way it is shown in films.
For the country's less well-off millions, this growing acceptance of English within Indian culture may have little immediate relevance. But as the language continues to be embraced by India's young middle class, it seems destined to have a far-reaching influence on the future of Indian society.
I think it's too late to resist anything. I mean, there's no point. You know, you've got English, it's become part of the fabric of the country. It's an Indian language. It's not a foreign language, not anymore. And I think the task at hand is to be able to own it, you know, and define your own version of how you use the language.
In Japan, where English has no historic foothold, the seductive power of Western-based culture, packaged in the form of movies, fashion, and music, has created a tremendous growth in the appeal of English.
English-based culture has always been something that Japanese in general always adored or looking for, something that they dream about. And the younger they are, especially like the teenagers, this hip-hop culture from the States, they just adore it. I think they are absorbing Western culture much, much more than people in the 30s or people in the 40s. For instance, Mission Impossible 2, the sunglasses that Tom Cruise has been wearing was sold out for like 6 months. I feel movie is a brand. Though the studio is providing us huge research data, we also do a market research here in Japan. So we may have to change the methodology. For an example, sometime we will localize a poster for a movie. So the studio really appreciates the fact that we are dealing with a different group of people based on a different culture in Japan. Like second grade kid may want dubbed, they may want subtitled, but for like fourth grade, they definitely want English. They want to hear English, the same voice as he or she is really speaking. So they are trying to capture the information from the subtitles with an English spoken environment.
The Japanese appetite for all things Western has created one of the world's most important markets for the fashion industry, driven by a relentless shopping culture. In Tokyo, designer labels abound.
We sell in about 42 countries around the world. Our biggest market is Japan. We have an astonishing 200, they call them shops, but in fact they're quite big areas, often in department stores, but a lot of shops on the street. The business there is enormous. We're the biggest, most popular European designer in Japan. It's been very hard work. I mean, I've been there 50 times or something. I think they just like it because it's just down-to-earth Englishness.
I think the biggest reason why Paul Smith business is very successful in Japan is because Paul Smith himself comes to Japan twice a year. And he tried to communicate with customers, and that's very surprising, and that's very good for customers.
But by far the most successful cultural export remains music. British and American bands attract a massive Japanese following, in spite of the linguistic divide. And the teenage cults of the West are ever present in the local music scene.
I'm a bilingual DJ, and my forte is more on the Western music rather than the local music, and I feel when you're introducing American or British songs, I like to do it in English. It's just like, you don't eat sushi with a knife and a fork. I think it's becoming very globalized. I think the global club culture, the underground scene, I think that's very connected throughout the world. And I think that has actually helped Japan very much.
And for Japanese bands like Babamania, their route to a wide overseas audience is to sing in English.
Unlike other Japanese bands, these guys had something original and had a hard music but with a female singer, so I thought I'd go check them out. When I did see them, I realized I had to sign them right away.
Here in the Japanese underground, there are a lot of musicians and DJs and track makers and all these guys who are struggling to get their sound out, you know, and they're doing it quite well, you know. So I think that if all of these people see the value in what they're doing enough and persevere enough, then it will change.
All of us loves Red Hot Chili Peppers or Fishbone, like mixture rock music. I love Bob Marley or the kind of message songs. I love it. So I want to make them mix up.
You'll find these young kids, especially if you see this club tonight, I bet you none of those guys will buy domestic artists as such. They usually buy foreign artists or ones that sing in English.
I mean, look at throughout Asia, it's usually all influenced by Western music. You know, the kids, they wear Levi's, they drink, they go to McDonald's. They want Western music, so and they want their own domestic pop stars to sound like domestic.
I grew up with American and UK music, so it was natural to sing it or to make the lyrics with English.
In order to possibly make it in America, they will have to speak in English. Japanese bands have tried in the past and it just does not work out.
Yeah, that's the biggest dream, is for them to all make it in America or England. Because since all they've ever listened to is Western bands, they want to go over there and be respected by them.
For the most part, the music market is inundated with Americans or Brits. And so I guess for the rest of the world, they want to be there, in the midst of it all, like right there on the front lines, you know, sharing the stage with everybody else.
Wake it up.